I'm Dr. Mitchell Perry, and this is If I Knew Then What I Know Now. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time to this broadcast, to give you a little bit of background, my particular training is as a counseling psychologist. I am licensed and board certified, and I have been in the behavior change, relationship effectiveness, and performance effectiveness business for many years. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to my colleague in the studio. His name is Rob Holland. He and I have known each other for several years and discussed a while ago his particular interest in being on the air with me to discuss the nature of how he has grown over the last several years. And I've had the special privilege to help him do just that. And he called me a while ago and said, listen, I would like to talk about my story, because if I knew then what I know now, then I probably would have developed a lot sooner in my lifetime. I thought to myself, I've lost count after all these years of working with people around the world, how often they have said to me some form of, gee, Dr. Perry, if I knew then what I know now, which therefore suggests that people would much prefer to learn these lessons a lot sooner in life so they could actually have a by far more fulfilling, successful, and satisfying trip during their lifetime. So when Rob said to me, I would like to see if we can record this to spread this information of what I've learned over the years, there must be an enormous population of people who've experienced some form of the same thing, meaning having to learn lessons, sometimes the hard way, having to learn lessons much later in life, when really you would have preferred to learn those lessons a lot sooner. Chapter 1, If I Knew Then What I Know Now. Rob, pleasure to see you once again.
This is great, Dr. Perry. I've been looking forward to this for a couple months now since we talked.
And we have known each other for how long?
6 years.
6 years. Boy, did that go by fast. Whenever you think about either your age or your duration of time in business, or the length of time that you've been married, or just thinking about your life, and the birthdays go by faster. My father told me in my 20s, he said, now listen, son, make sure you enjoy every moment, because before you know it, you're going to look like me. And I said, because of course that was during the period of time when I was brilliant, I said, yeah, Dad, yeah, of course, Dad. Of course, now Dad is in heaven, and I look like him, and I sound like him, and I'm much older, and it went by in a heartbeat, and my dad is laughing in heaven at me because, one, I quit being brilliant because I thought it was overrated, and two, I decided to trade in brilliance for wisdom. And so it goes by really quickly, and the mere fact that you said, could we do this recording to tell my story? Would you be willing to do that with me? I jumped on it right away. I thought, what a great idea. So let's begin, shall we?
Yeah, I was really pleased to get that reaction from you. I think my observation over particularly the last few years is how interested people are in the kinds of topics you and I would discuss. So some background for everybody. We first met at a corporate training event.
Yes.
And so there was probably 30 professionals in that room.
Yes.
I was in there getting some training on your executive communication and persuasion skills, really lit up about those and wanted to come talk to you about them. And in that discussion, there was something very unexpected that happened that really, I think, launched this whole thing. And it might be interesting for us to even start there, because when I tell this story I have over the years, it just opens up a whole series of questions and dialogue that makes me think that people would be interested to hear.
I remember we had a couple exchanges, and then I asked a question, and you looked shocked.
Exactly right. So this is a good place to start. Let's replay that event. I'd be curious to hear, even from your standpoint, what's your recollection of this? Here's my recollection.
This was 6 or 7 years ago.
This was the very first time we met. This is 6 years ago.
Go ahead.
So we're there for training. In between the segments of the training you're giving on the Pull, which I recommend everybody go out there and check out the Pull.
Right.
In between each of the segments of your training, each of the partners were to stand up and give a presentation about their part of the practice. So I'm a consultant. I help companies implement digital technology to improve relationships with their customers. And so when it was my turn to go up and give a speech about my practice and our vision and focus and where we're going, you were in attendance, you were observing this. So when I grabbed you later, I think it was toward the end of the day, to introduce myself and talk about how I wanted to follow up and learn more about the persuasion skills, you had said some very complimentary things to me, which I remember to this day. They meant a great deal to me. You said, Rob, great energy. Everybody was really focused in on what you were saying. Good use of humor. You're obviously very articulate. Great stuff. And then you said, what's with all the undoing?
What's with all the undoing? And you had shock and bewilderment on your face.
That's right.
Right.
And immediately, while certainly you need to help me fill in the blanks, it was as if I had been found out. And so I was stunned. Yeah. It was feeling a shock because I knew when I was up giving that presentation that there were parts of me that were decidedly uncomfortable in that situation.
And you had advertised how uncomfortable you were.
And it was for the first time for me confirmation that people could tell. And that's what was so...
well, that was a perfect example of what most people do. Most people try to cover up whatever liabilities or whatever holes there are, and they want to focus on being buttoned up. And yet most people advertise exactly what's going on with themselves, only all the time.
And I was shocked to learn the way I was doing that. So you said, Rob, what's with all the undoing? I said, what are you talking about? Obviously, every nerve in my body's firing off. And then you say to me, well, you know, the very first words out of your mouth at the beginning of your presentation was, I know I'm the youngest partner here, but.
Right.
And then you went on to speak about all these things you care deeply about. And I did some various form of similar things throughout the presentation a number of times, apparently.
Well, you started making excuses for yourself from the very beginning.
And so you asked me, what made you feel like you needed to give people permission to disagree with you before you even started?
Or give people permission to think that you were lucky to be up there because you're so young and so stupid.
That's right. And so in that moment, I was hit between the eyes. And I knew there was something there. And that, in essence, that moment formed the basis of this 6-year relationship that you and I have had.
Just to let our audience have a greater sense of understanding of undoing, sometimes it's called failure forecasting. And you did a form of that too. You're probably not going to like this. This probably won't work. You know, I don't have much education about this. You know, I really haven't thought about this carefully, but... Or I am the youngest partner in the room, but, or, you know, to the extent that I even have sort of researched this very much, the reality is I've just started researching it yesterday. You know, whenever anybody advertises up front that you're defective or that I'm less educated or less bright or I'm lucky to be here or I don't know much about this, but whenever anybody does that, essentially it's saying, take whatever I say with a grain of salt because there's much smarter, brighter people and deserving in this room than I. And that's what's undoing. Undoing means I need to discount or invalidate what I'm going to say up front so you will know that I'm already defective and lucky to be dressing myself.
Which is crazy because the irony here is I was the youngest partner in the room that day, which you would normally think would be something to be proud of. Except in my case, the original thinking back then was somehow I got over on these folks to be a young partner here.
Well, you're an imposter.
It's the exact right word, the imposter complex, which is something that I had never heard of. And in society, we'll start hearing people talking about this stuff a little bit more now. 6 years ago, though, I had zero clue there was something out there called an imposter complex. I had even less clue that this is part of our shared humanity, that everybody feels this way. And so not only did I have the imposter complex, I thought I was the only one. Soon, at some point, I was going to be found out, and then, of course, I'd be screwed, which was what was going on beneath the surface, which was the source of the undoing.
All right. So you came up to me. I made some complimentary remarks. Then I said, by the way, what's with the undoing? You were somewhere between shocked and perhaps exposed. And clueless about what I was talking about.
Also
I
true.
Explained what undoing was about, and then
immediately had me reach out to have more conversation. So you and I, now over the course of the remaining 6 years here, have met over Skype dozens of times. We've been at other events. You've even hosted a group of men for what we call the Men's Weekend, which is a 3-day incredibly intensive experience. And so we've done all of those things. The place that you started with me was what you wanted me to understand, the difference between internally and externally grounded.
What you were doing is what everybody does. 90% of all grown-ups out there operate from fear or self-doubt or weakness. Invariably, they have decided that they're entirely too defective for words, so therefore everybody's dealing with fear and shame and guilt and concern and feeling inadequate and insecure, all that kind of stuff, and what you were doing was some form of the same thing. And because learning how to operate from strength is something that I've mastered and teach all the time, it occurred to me that if you're funny and bright and good looking and young and all those things, then you might want to actually operate from strength as opposed to doubting yourself, as most everybody does. And so that got your attention. And now you're saying, well, one of the things you learned from that conversation was the difference between being internally and externally grounded. So, by the way, I can talk about this ad nauseum in a very short period of time. Having said that, talk to me from your view, what is the difference between internally and externally grounded?
There was an amazing analogy that you used that makes this so simple and clear with the cup. A very interesting way to think about this, there was a cup of coffee. Matter of fact, we'll just use this little cup right here.
Okay.
And let's just say this cup represents your self-respect and, feeling, worthy of being in that situation, whatever that situation might be, sitting across from the executive, sitting across from your wife's parents, your parents, whatever it might be.
Your adequacy is in the cup.
Is in the cup.
Right.
Now, what somebody who is externally grounded would do is they're constantly passing that cup around for people to fill that up for them so they can feel like
or to take care of it.
Or to take care of it.
Right.
Now, the thing that you said to me, which I thought was pretty fantastic, is, Rob, when you sit down in front of that senior executive and you push that cup across the table, do they know that they have that cup?
No.
Of course not.
Right.
And even if they knew that they had your cup, would they want it?
No.
No. And then the other thing that you said was, so first of all, the key, take responsibility for your cup. Nobody wants your damn cup anyway.
Right.
The other thing that you told me about this that have always stuck with me that I want everybody out there to know is the amount of time or energy that other person, let's say that other executive sitting across the table from you, is thinking about you is very limited. So how silly then was it for me to walk out of that meeting and for days be thinking about
how much he's taking care of your cup.
How smart did he think I was, or how effective did she think I would be in leading this, or whatever it might be.
Right.
You said to me something that was pretty harsh and yet sweet at the same time. You said, Rob, you and I talk on a regular basis. I hold you in very high regard. I think you're a great guy. And the reality is, after our conversations are over, I'm not thinking about you. I'm the star in my own movie.
That's right.
We're not really spending a lot of time thinking about you.
Exactly. Who is everybody's favorite subject?
So the other thing about externally grounded that is so ridiculous, and again, I just wish somebody would have told me a long time ago, because once you know this, you can't unlearn it. It's just so obvious and so true, is that people just aren't putting that much energy into evaluating you in the first place.
Right. He's not that into you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this concept of walking around in your professional life, your personal life, wherever it might be, and continually trying to take measurements of what you think, you're being judged and evaluated, people just aren't paying attention to you that much anyway.
No, which is kind of a disappointment.
A little bit so. It's also a complete waste of energy.
Well, there's that.
And this is where I think it comes back to your whole topic of operating from strength or compensating for weakness. Think of all of the energy and strife that I had, and I think many of my colleagues who've opened up to me about similar experiences in the years when we talked about this, all the wasted and misplaced energy that goes into trying to put on some sort of facade, protect yourself from that judgment, constantly be guessing, how am I doing in this game that doesn't exist in anybody's mind but your own. It's just an amazing, externally grounded is an incredibly wasteful way to spend your time.
So when you think about externally grounded, what you're really saying is, if I give that cup to the executive or the boss or the customer or whoever it is, if I give that cup to them, I essentially gave them charge of my adequacy.
Correct.
My value, my quality, whatever I bring to the table, they're now in charge of it.
That's right.
Right. And they're unaware that they're in charge of it.
That's exactly right.
And if they knew that they were in charge of it, they certainly would want to avoid being in charge of it.
And I know this to be true because if you were to put the situation in reverse, let's say I have somebody from my team coming in to talk to me about even their performance or
and
whatever
he
it might
puts
be.
his cup to you.
I don't want his cup.
Right. Okay. So the next question is, if you give him charge of your adequacy,
Correct.
did he take it from you or did you give it to him?
I gave it.
Tell me about that.
We've just talked about how the other individual would be oblivious to this in the first place.
Right.
They're just not thinking in that orientation. So
Right.
this all exists in my own head. Me giving that responsibility to somebody else.
Did you ever, prior to our conversation, imagine that you were actually unconsciously and routinely giving them your cup?
Absolutely not.
Did you ever figure out what that was about? What would make you want to give him, her, them charge over your value?
Now you're getting into a deep question because
everybody does that.
Yeah.
Almost everybody.
Yeah, so you're probably going to have to help me out here. I mean, there's a lot of things that you and I talked about in the ensuing months that followed about, the way, people come. I think childhood consciousness is the first thing that pops in my mind, the way.
Well, certainly, yeah. Well, let's try this on for size.
All
Let's
right,
do
let's do it.
something really simple.
Okay.
When you give somebody charge of your value, which I say, here's my cup of value, please take care of it. And by the way, fill it up, make me feel better.
Right.
When you do that, to what extent do you want them, whoever they are, to like you, to respect you, to appreciate you, to reinforce you?
Oh, 100%. That's the whole point.
Okay, which
Yeah.
therefore would suggest you really are dependent on them liking you, respecting you, appreciating you, reinforcing you.
So much so that if you came out of that meeting and felt like you had failed to earn that, it would ruin your entire weekend.
You give others the charge of your value.
That's right.
They're supposed to take care of it. They're unaware that they're in charge of it. If they did know they're in charge of it, they certainly would want to avoid that.
Correct.
And you are now hostage to how much they're thinking about you and reinforcing you.
Correct. Which
And
is so ridiculous
Well-
when you say it out loud like that.
Yeah.
And of course, this is why I wish 20 years ago you and I could have sat down and had this conversation. We would have saved a lot of unnecessary strife.
Let's imagine a conversation we had where I said, well, let's just suppose you have this cup, and in the cup is all your value beyond skin and bones and organs. So,
Right.
that which makes Rob is in the cup.
Yep,
All right. Ideally, who owns it?
I do.
And yet, what you discovered, which produced the concern about undoing and I'm
Obviously,
the
sure.
youngest but, and I'm lucky to be breathing but, and all
Right.
that stuff. The excuses and the forecasting of failure, you just automatically gave either perfect strangers or people you just met control over your cup.
Correct.
To what extent did it ever occur to you prior to that conversation that ideally you're in charge of your cup?
I would just say the concept of the cup and its existence was something that I hadn't really thought of.
All
This
right.
was all outside of my.
All right. So when you started, I mean, of course, I got you to take back your cup and
That's right.
operate from strength and be internally grounded.
That's right.
Grounded means just like an electrical circuit, the ground makes it stabilized. If you're internally grounded, that means more than half the time,
Right.
the person who's in charge of your value would be you.
That's right.
Okay. So that was a brand new idea that you could perhaps do that?
So yes, brand new idea, and all of a sudden, any number of things that had been confusing me through life to that point started to make sense. For example, for as insecure as I was, it used to confuse the hell out of me that people would think I was arrogant.
Yeah.
Do you remember this conversation you and I had
Oh,
about this?
yes. I've
so-
only talked about this 18,000 times in my career.
So I could never understand how sometimes people would think I was arrogant if they would only know that I was like desperately trying to fit in and whatever. And so as you and I talked about it, what became clear is when you're putting on this show, in essence, it comes across as fake. It comes across as know-it-all. It comes across as any number of things that is opposite of what you're intending. It's giving you the opposite of what you're really trying to go for. And I wonder if that's something that you could
Sure.
expand on a little bit, because I think this is a key point for people out there to understand that this can somehow impact the way they are perceived.
Okay, let me make some remarks about that one. You said for a better part of your lifetime up until that point, you had this dread, this ongoing fear, concern, worry that they, whoever they are, would consider you to be arrogant, which could be egocentric, pompous, conceited, full of yourself, any of that stuff. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Which would therefore suggest in your head, though it was probably less than conscious, that you had two options when it came to your perception of yourself. The two options are either, one, you're very insecure and you doubt yourself and you're lucky to be breathing and you got to make excuses for yourself because, of course, they have to decide you're okay,
right,
in the interest of being meek, mild, humble, and self-effacing.
Right.
Or the other option is, of course, you're conceited and egocentric and pompous and arrogant. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. So has that ever occurred to you that that could be called a catch-22?
It certainly does now.
Okay. What's a catch-22?
It's a lose-lose situation.
All right. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Correct.
All right. So let me see if I understand this, because this is very, very common amongst grown-ups, frankly, everywhere. Certainly in developed countries, where you have two choices. You're either perpetually inadequate and defective and self-effacing and perpetually chasing the need to be meek, mild, humble, and self-effacing.
That's right.
Or you're egocentric, pompous, conceited, full of yourself. Well, that sounds like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, if you decide to feel good about yourself for a minute, then of course you're conceited and pompous and arrogant, or you have to continually do the undoing. That sounds like a setup for a letdown. So let's just imagine, if you will, you've got your self-concept, your self-esteem, your view of your own value. Mm-hmm. And let's suppose there's a line that's bifurcated in the middle, and everything on the left is self-effacing and meek and mild and humble and self-doubting and self-failure and excuses and undoing and all that. And let's suppose right in the middle, you're now on the right side of that gradient, and let's suppose now in your head you've only got the threat that the moment you feel good about yourself and you trust your judgment and you operate from self-respect, then everybody's going to think you're arrogant, pompous, and conceited. Is that a setup for a letdown? Because it's a lose-lose.
I would say so.
Well, where did you get the idea there's only two choices?
It sounds to me like there's a magical, dare I say, third option.
There is a third one, and this is, I think, one of the things that got you into deciding to abandon this need to be perpetually meek, mild, humble, and self-effacing. And that is, if you look at the left side of the gradient, where you have to continually feel insecure, defective, unlovable, broken, inadequate, then could we say you might be belonging to the UIP? And if you remember the UIP is the acronym for the Union of Inadequate People.
Correct.
Now, could we say if you are belonging, and you apparently did for many years belong to the Union of Inadequate People, here's the question. To what extent was there great group pressure to maintain membership in that union?
Comes in many forms. The best way I can describe this is I know my friends have changed over the last few years, because there are people who hold themselves to high standards, accept when they make mistakes, accept when you make mistakes. It's a much more real conversation, a real
so
friendship.
These are people who do trust their judgment a lot.
That's right.
And these are people who do achieve and feel good about themselves.
That's right.
So question, were they largely your friends many years ago?
Yes.
Did you know that, or did you continually hang around people who were feeling inadequate?
A few. I think what's really happened is the number of friends I have shrunk, and the ones that I still have are much more deeper friendships.
All right. So do I understand that since you decided to perhaps see if you could resign from the Union of Inadequate People, you found another place to be?
That's right.
So now let's go to the other side of the two options, the catch-22, the
right.
damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
So how much did you, prior to meeting me, start thinking you had two options? One is you are hostage to what they think all the time, and therefore you want them to take care of your value. Or if you say for a second you feel good about yourself, then you're arrogant and pompous and conceited and egocentric. I mean, you actually believed that. Is that right?
Obviously, I wasn't thinking about it in those terms.
You were deathly afraid of being perceived of as arrogant.
I was, correct.
Okay. So could we say the fear that they may accuse you of being conceited, egocentric, pompous, arrogant was so profound, you kept on undoing.
Correct.
Well, first, could we say there is a rather large population of the union of inadequate people, people who actually stay feeling self-doubt and unhappy.
Yes. And simply, by the way, that's this imposter complex that people talk a lot about today. Yep. A very common thing, especially in consulting, if you think about it. We put ourselves, we drop into these client environments. We have very short periods of time to work. We're our rates are pretty high. There's all the pressure to be brilliant. And I think it's just a kind of a pressure cooker for imposter syndrome. And so I think, there's quite a large population.
In growing up, did you ever hear somebody say some form of, who the hell does he think he is?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever hear some form of, he sure likes himself, or he certainly is full of himself?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, and so that added to the concern that you'd be called arrogant or conceited.
Correct.
All right, so it is a catch-22. So let's examine, instead of two groups, the Union of Inadequate People, the UIP, and the second group, which is the COC. The COC is the acronym for the Canyon of Conceit. Now, here's the question. How many people do you know that truly are conceited the vast majority of the time?
Very few.
And the reason it's so difficult to be legitimately conceited is, one, life will take a big bite out of you. Life is difficult. My experience is most people who can only be legitimately conceited are people who have enough money. You have to have enough money.
You're going to be that much of a jerk. You're going to have to.
You have to. The expense of having the people around you somehow kowtowing and telling you how wonderful you are is a very high expense. Yeah. So you'll notice people who are legitimately conceited, one, invariably have a lot of money. Two, over a period of time, tend to lose their money. And three, generally fail from being conceited. It's very difficult to do it. My guess is you lack that kind of cash.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
I do too. All right. So therefore, I remember, by the way, in fifth grade, there was a contest in the class about spelling. And there was this chart on the wall with everybody's name. And when you did well with the spelling test, you'd get stars. And I remember the two smartest people in the class were Louise Nussbaum and me. And I remember she was doing really well with straight A's, and I remember she was always doing well with the spelling test, and I was bound and determined to be a better speller than her. So what happened is I got a whole lot more stars, and she got a bunch of them, and I got a whole lot more stars. And when it was abundantly clear that I was going to win the spelling test, this was my first experience with the word conceit. And the kids said in class to me, you're so conceited. And that was the first time I ever heard the word conceited. And when I concluded, well, that probably is bad. And then I was bewildered because I was unaware what conceited means. Never mind, I won the spelling test. And that was the first time I started thinking, I think what I'm supposed to feel is bad or shame because I won the spelling test. And I remember thinking, that's kind of stupid, that I really should feel badly or insecure that I won the spelling test. When really, you're so conceited was clearly, your winning the spelling test reminds me that this is other kids, reminds me that I did less well in the spelling test, so to feel better, I got to put you down. That was my first experience of what's happened in my lifetime. Supposing there's a third option.
Yeah, this is the magical third option.
Right.
Yeah.
The third option is in between the Union of Inadequate People. It's in between the UIP and it's independent of the Canyon of Conceit. So let's call it the gap.
Let's call it the gap.
It's a word that is actually a word, and it's also an acronym. The GAP stands for the Guild. It's bigger than a committee and smaller than a union. The Guild of Adequate People.
Yep.
What that simply means is if I won the spelling test, I can feel good about it. If you climb the mountain and it was difficult and you get up there, you can feel good about it. You can be the youngest partner in your firm and you can feel good about that achievement. You actually do allow yourself self-respect, confidence, trusting your judgment, feeling good about being adequate.
And so there were a few things I can remember when you and I first talked about the gap that we worked on that were surprisingly uncomfortable, as simple as they sound. There are two that I remember right off the bat right now. The first was harvesting compliments.
Yes.
So historically, if I'd get a compliment, I would deflect, and it made me really uncomfortable. The absurdity of that, of course, is the number one thing I'm trying to do in all of this is make deep, meaningful connections with people.
Well, you want them to be impressed with you.
And I wanted to be impressed.
And then occasionally they gave you a compliment.
That's right. And then occasionally they would make that expression, and then I would deflect it.
Of course, because you would deflect it because...
Felt unworthy.
So could we say... most people invariably deflate or deflect or invalidate compliments.
That's right.
Could we say most people want compliments?
Yes.
And they get compliments.
Right.
And then they invalidate the compliments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
It is absurd. We're going to go through that in just a moment on that very subject matter. You said that when we got through the notion of undoing, then you understood the cup. Then you understood the whole notion of a catch-22.
Yep.
You either are inadequate and hostage to their reinforcement, or you're conceited. In both cases, you're just miserable.
That's right.
Then you figured out there's something called a gap, meaning I could join the group of people who actually are feeling good about themselves without that perpetual fear of being conceited. And yet, along the way, you realized every time anybody gives me a compliment, I invalidate it. What would you say if I told you that virtually everybody does that? They get a compliment and then they invalidate or deflect it.
I see it all the time.
What did you learn?
Add this to the list of things that are now so obvious in common sense that I just wish somebody had told me 20 years ago.
By the way, remember, common sense is very uncommon.
I know, that's just right. So a few things about that struck me. One was, not only are you invalidating the compliment, you're invalidating the expression from the other person.
Explain.
Well, just think about it. So when I received a compliment, somebody was wanting to really reach out and make a connection, which is what I desperately want, to have deep, meaningful connections with people. When I discount it, then I'm discounting them and their thought and
You're
their
discounting
expression.
them.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah.
Did you know that at the time?
Absolutely not.
No. Okay.
And I just, so
well,
now.
tell you what, let's demonstrate.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to give you a compliment, and you're going to do what everybody does.
That's right.
The vast majority of the time, you're going to discount or invalidate whatever that is and watch what happens. Then I'll ask you a few questions.
All right, let's do it.
All right, here we go. Rob, I am so impressed with your development over the last several years, and the value that you bring to the table is enormous, and there's an enormously large population of people who want you to either provide a service or they want to hire you, for that matter, which clearly validates either you really are a complete imposter or you probably are as impressive as I believe you are. So I really am impressed with you over all of that.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks, Doc. I certainly have a long way to go. There's, certainly way more of this that I need to delve in, and I'm going to keep working at it. Got a long way to go.
So could we say you did a form of invalidating or discounting my compliment? That's
correct.
To what extent could I, listening to your invalidation, think you just told me I'm wrong?
At a minimum.
Am I now disallowed from being impressed with you?
That's right.
You ever see people, you've lost weight. Oh, I'm so fat.
Ironically, this happened with you and I yesterday evening. I came in and you said, this actually happened just yesterday. You said, hey, you lost some weight. I remember my response was, yeah, you should have seen me a few weeks ago before I put a good chunk of this back on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so clearly, I'll say you're a work in progress.
Yeah, that's right. You said you must have missed yourself? I think that's what you said.
Yeah, you must have missed yourself.
Okay, so the discounting of the compliment, and I see it all the time, and of course, it's very counterproductive, and it's a blocker to that connection, to the glue in the relationship.
All right, so let's look at the obvious. If I give you a compliment, and of course you want the reinforcement.
Yes.
And then you invalidate or discount the compliment,
right?
Which means you're essentially telling me I'm wrong, and therefore I'm disallowed to think that you're impressive. To what extent over a period of time, I'm just going to quit telling you anything nice?
That's exactly right.
All right, so could we say, if I'm going to quit telling you anything nice, then I'm going to quit giving you the very thing that you want, because you just essentially invalidated me, telling me I'm wrong, so I'm going to quit.
So that's how ridiculous this whole thing is.
Okay, so could we say the very thing that you want, you actually prevent?
Correct.
Has that occurred to you 6 years ago?
It occurred to me for the first time when you told me.
Yeah.
And this is where it's just like one of these things. It's just a handful. Why can't we just tell people when they're like, maybe high school would be too young because you're just too caught up in your own small universe at the time. Why is there not a course in college or something that just gets people some baseline foundation understanding of our shared humanity? That imposter complex is something that we all share.
That's a really good question to confirm why there's an absence of that in school. When you think about the lessons you have learned, and you're in your 40s now,
Yep.
Could we say you've learned some lessons about how life really is?
Yes.
And some foundational habits and skill sets that you have to learn in order to be successful. Have you learned that?
Yeah.
Okay. Could we say there's two that come to mind right off the top? One is being fiscally literate. What that means is you have to know something at the very least about managing money. And at the most, you got to learn something about managing and making money. Is that true?
I think so.
All right. How important is managing and making money in the lifetime?
Very important.
And to what extent is that ever in school curriculums?
Pretty poorly.
So could we say it's almost always gone since there have been schools?
That's right.
All right. So one of the most important things you have to know about life is money and handling it, and it's missing from school curriculums. Is it any wonder that there's an enormous population of people who are broke?
No.
Right. I just read a thing in USA Today, and it said some form of 80% of baby boomers, and baby boomers, I'm a baby boomer. Baby boomers are people that are now beginning to retire. 80% of baby boomers lack more than $20,000 in the bank.
That's crazy.
And so my thoughts are, when you retire, I think you quit making money, so you got 20 grand. How fast are you going to blow through that? I mean, that's just insane. All right, so we could talk money and fiscal literacy is one of the things you have to learn. How about the next one? How important, and now you're married and you've got children, and you got an extended family, then you have this whole network of people with whom you do business,
Correct.
And then you have your special friends.
Yeah.
So these are large populations of people, many of whom are extraordinarily important to you.
That's right.
So question, how important, because you're a high-tech consultant, how important is managing relationships effectively?
Incredibly important.
All right. And to what extent was that taught in schools?
Never.
Okay. So let me see. Two of the most important things you have to learn about life is managing money, fiscal literacy, and all things relationship effectiveness. Is that right?
I think so.
Including a relationship with yourself.
Maybe even first and foremost, a relationship with yourself.
Okay, so could we say two of the most important things you really have to learn have been missing from school curriculums
That's correct.
since there have been schools?
That's
Now, question, would you say fiscal literacy and relationship effectiveness would be in the bandwidth of what you and I would call common sense?
Yes.
And as you know, common sense is very uncommon.
Yeah, it's common now. So let me bring us back to this concept of the gap.
All right.
Would it be helpful for us to demonstrate harvesting a compliment? Because that was the exercise that you gave me.
All right. So what I do often, and if the listening audience here wants to get a pen or a pencil, it's a good idea to do so. When it comes to dealing with somebody complimenting you, you have three options. This will bring you back to a conversation we had some time ago. The first option is to keep discounting and invalidating. Number one, discount is called how most people handle compliments, which is let's discount it and invalidate it, all in the interest of being meek, mild, self-effacing, and humble.
Right.
Number two is called accept. What that means is I give you a compliment, and all you say is thank you. And if you think about thank you, it really is thank you for thinking the way you think. Meaning, do you have to tell me I'm wrong by discounting? The answer is no. So you just say thank you for thinking the way you think. And number three, which of course is the hit it out of the park skill set that scares most people, is harvest. So number one is discount, number two is accept, and number three is harvest. So let's practice and accept just for the moment.
Okay.
All right. All I want you to say is thank you.
Got it.
All right. Rob, one of the things that I particularly admire about you is your ability to really speak effectively and organize your thoughts. Your command of the language is very good, and there's an absence of fillers or like. Basically, you really have a very good command of the language. That impresses me a lot.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Perry.
How's that feel?
Feels good.
Okay. And are you telling me, thank you for thinking the way you think, Dr. Perry?
Pretty much.
All right. Are you saying thank you, but?
There was an absence of a but.
That's right. So could we say accepting would actually be good?
Accepting's great.
You may want to actually let me think you're impressive.
That's right.
All right. I always give number 2 as the homework assignment for everybody I work with, because to jump to harvesting is for most people a shock, and a harvest is a thank you, tell me more.
That's right.
Now, most of the time people think, are you crazy? I'm supposed to say, thank you, tell me more? And my thoughts are, well, you might want to package it slightly differently. And having said that, essentially, that's it.
Right.
Thank you, tell me more. And so I demonstrate it, and then people say, oh, gee, that was pretty good. Meaning they're surprised because the fear and the dread that they often feel that somebody's going to think, oh, God, you really are conceited and pompous and egocentric.
Exactly.
And arrogant. How could I possibly say, thanks, tell me more? And yet the reality is, when you do harvest, I will tell you more. So here we go. You ready?
Let's do it.
I'm going to give you a compliment. You're going to...
By the way, we can do these compliments as many times as you want. I think for the listeners to really get this skill down, we should do 6, 7, 8 of these.
I think so. Let's do 6, 7, 8 dozen of these.
All right,
at which point
we're going to harvest this
the
time.
Listening audience just
right.
might tune out at that point.
All right, here we go.
All right, third option. Here we go. One of the things that I particularly like about you is your voracious appetite to learn how to replace counterproductive thoughts and behaviors with productive ones. As a result, your ambition keeps going up, your effectiveness keeps going up. There's I notice, because of people I know now that know you, I notice that they are really motivated to either get advice from you or to learn more of this kind of stuff that you have learned. And that just says you have capitalized on this stuff, this journey that I've had the pleasure of working with you over the last 6 years. And I think you have a lot to be proud of, because you have done that with this voracious appetite and high standards. So that really impresses me.
Wow, Dr. Perry, thanks. That means a lot coming from you. The other people that you're seeing respond to this, what is it that you see?
An example is I talk to some people that know you and spend time with you. And I notice when they tell me about you, they say very flattering and impressive things, and they make remarks about what they've learned from you. And that says they hold you in high stead, and they're happy to tell me that. Now, what's really kind of peculiar is most people will tell somebody else about how impressed they are of you, and rarely will they tell you. You notice the most common thing that people have to do in their lifetime to find out how loved and respected they were is to go to their own funeral. Generally people say, oh, I really loved Rob. Wasn't he terrific? Right. And my thoughts are, how about we learn that and hear that before we're laid into the ground? I mean, that just seems insane. I did I think you're impressive. You did the thanks, tell me more. And was I happy to tell you more?
Absolutely. Yeah,
so,
it felt great.
Now, years later, you're okay with accepting, and you're certainly okay with harvesting. What have you noticed now that you have quit invalidating, except for perhaps yesterday? Because, of course, you're so fat.
It's true. I just noticed that, particularly in close friendships, the way that we speak with each other has gotten much more deep and honest. So I noticed that we find opportunities to support and compliment each other more often, and it just leads into just more relationship glue, I guess is the best way to put it.
And when you think about relationship glue,
right,
how important has that been in your lifetime?
Well, it's always been incredibly important in my lifetime.
And now how is it actually getting stickier?
And now I'm getting much more effective at developing those deep connections with the people.
So could we say the very thing you've wanted is now actually bearing fruit because they've changed or you've changed?
Because I've changed.
You've changed your state of mind.
That's right.
And you've changed your habits, replacing counterproductive states of mind, or what I call counterproductive glasses.
Right.
You're looking at new glasses, and then in addition to that, you are replacing old habits with new habits.
I think so. There's a second exercise in addition to harvesting compliments that was incredibly uncomfortable at first. It was called the cheese list.
The cheese list.
Do you remember the cheese list?
I do. I just prescribed a cheese list to one of my patients recently. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the cheese.
So admittance into the gap.
Yes.
One of the prices of admission is this ability to acknowledge your strengths and your weaknesses and be okay with all of it.
So if you belong to the gap, that means you're perfectly willing to talk about what's good and what needs work.
That's right.
All right. As opposed to you're defective and lucky to be breathing because you're so stupid, or you're just a perfect person all the time.
That's true. And I think also what you said is what you focus on expands. And
Yep.
so this is where the cheese list becomes an interesting analogy, because if you're looking at a block of Swiss cheese, there are holes in the cheese.
Yes.
Now, if you're constantly beating yourself up, if you're in that UIP, which part of the cheese are you typically focused on? The part that's missing.
The questions I always ask are, when you go to buy Swiss cheese, you notice that you got cheese in holes.
That's right.
So when you buy the Swiss cheese, are you buying the cheese or the holes?
Buying the cheese,
When you're eating the Swiss cheese, are you eating the cheese or the holes?
eating that cheese.
So could we say, therefore, the holes are kind of like the price of admission?
That's right.
So the next question is, what has more volume in a block of Swiss cheese?
The cheese.
And yet most people continually focus on,
The holes.
which is the absence of cheese.
That's right.
Right. So one of the things I asked you to do was make a cheese list.
That's right.
So explain a cheese list.
The cheese list was to write down, and there was an expectation that there would be a long list of everything that I consider myself to be good to great to exceptional at. Anything and everything. Could be physical properties, it could be talents, it could be whatever it might be. The cheese list, what is the present cheese, the good stuff, write it all down.
And the mere thought
Yeah.
of writing a list of all of your cheese items
That's right.
initially felt like what?
Daunting, very very uncomfortable, and to the point that you can get a good 6, 8, maybe 10. You were expecting pages, so
Yes.
what I found was like I could get a few. I'm.
You got about 5.
I was like, okay, I'm a high energy guy. Passionate. I wear my heart on my sleeve. I'm articulate. And then I'm
there's the wall.
And then I'm starting to sputter.
I'm sorry, I hit the wall.
I'm starting to sputter. So
Right.
So the interesting thing though is to put yourself in that place, to step back and objectively look at the balance, your scorecard, the cheese and the holes. And what, while it was uncomfortable at first, and you and I continue to talk about, there's a fairly long list of things there, more than enough to qualify me to be at the tables I'm sitting at.
So therefore, if you found there was a long list of cheese after you kept going back and trying to add to it,
That's right.
then of course now you're pompous and conceited and full of yourself and egocentric.
Right. Right. And then the really beautiful thing that I think starts to happen, and this is where, again, I think it comes to this whole shared humanity, is the best way I can describe it. We all have this imposter complex. So if you step back now,
We
and you
all suffer from too much self-doubt.
all of it, and so you step back and you understand, I am not alone in this silliness of beating myself up.
You have company.
If I step back and I look objectively at what I bring to the table, there's more than enough there
Right.
for me to be worthy of sitting at the table that I'm at. And there are a number of gaps. And everybody has gaps. And the more I am willing to acknowledge and even be open about those, as opposed to constantly trying to hide them, I'm also able to be much more effective in my role, my job, and in relationships.
You are aware that you are confusing this with common sense and logic. You know this.
So you talk about I think the analogy of the compliment and turning people away when they were reaching out to you in connection with what you really wanted more than anything. The same thing goes with our weaknesses. I think what you taught me, and we've talked about in various forms throughout the years, is the more you're out there trying to cover up for those weaknesses, to hide them, there's you're putting on some sort of show. Not that anybody ever expected you to be perfect anyway, so this is all completely unnecessary, but it also is a blocker from true and meaningful
Once again,
relationships.
preventing the very thing you want.
Another perfect example of that.
Yeah.
And so I think the cheese list for me was really powerful in that gave me the comfort to step back and just objectively look, regardless of the silliness voice in my head that might be, saying doubtful, kind of comments. Objectively, I deserve to be in that room. And while I do have gaps, everybody has gaps. I mean, we each
everybody
have different,
has holes in their cheese.
We each have different strengths, and so nobody's expecting.
Right.
I don't expect people to be perfect, and they didn't expect me to be perfect. And once my mind started kind of reassociating, my interactions with others around this new, kind of concept, that's when relationships got richer.
I want to wrap up this particular segment of the series called If I Knew Then What I Know Now, so that you can perhaps write some notes down, and we're going to, after the summary of this first segment, then we'll go into segment number 2. So as we think about what we've covered so far, Rob, we talked about the whole notion of being internally grounded. What that simply means is deciding that you are in charge of your value and your self-respect and your feeling of being adequate, as opposed to perpetually giving that to everybody else. From which we came to the notion of the Union of Inadequate People, the UIP, versus the Canyon of Conceit, which means if we thought that way and we were perpetually concerned about being arrogant and conceited, you're in a catch-22. You're a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Correct.
And you through our conversations, discovered there was a third group you could join, and ever since you have been largely in that third group, which is called what?
The Gap.
And tell me what the Gap means for you.
This is made up of a group of people that celebrate their strengths, acknowledge that they have weaknesses, that they're, instead of striving perfection, they're striving for excellence. They're striving for deep and meaningful relationships with other people, and they just go about their day doing the best they can.
And therefore, you now have a group of affiliates that are more in the Gap and less than the Union of Inadequate People. That means some people who prefer to stay in the Union of Inadequate People are now unhappy with you.
That's correct.
And that's the price of admission.
That's the way it rolls.
That's how it rolls. All right. And by the way, you'll notice professional victims belong to the UIP all the time.
That's right.
Nobody knows the pain I've suffered. You have no idea what I've gone through. His life is so difficult, and then you die. That whole notion of opting to be a weak, helpless victim somehow has the delicious agony of life as a attractive place to live. So I'm guessing you would like them to be inadequate by themselves. Is that right?
Unless they want to come join us in the Gap.
In the Gap, okay. From that, we also went to the notion of compliments and how people handle compliments. Give me your summary again on that one.
So when somebody gives you a compliment, that's an opportunity to make a connection, and the best way to do that is to, at a minimum, accept it, and if you can be comfortable with it, harvest it. Bring in some more.
Is that easy to do, since most people spend all their time invalidating or discounting a compliment?
It's going to take practice.
Okay. So could we say discounting a compliment is a habit that's so ubiquitous, it takes practice to realize you're about to discount the compliment you just got?
Very true.
All right. Then we talked about the notion of what you focus on expands. Tell me about that.
So this comes down to strengths and weaknesses, and which part are you focusing on for yourself? We all have weaknesses. Focusing on those, and in the process of doing so, discounting the strengths of what you bring to the table is I think a trap a lot of us fall into. Very simply, all we have to do is focus on the strengths and what we bring to the table, and emphasize those.
So therefore, whatever you focus on expands.
That's
so
right.
Let's focus on what's working well,
That's
as
right.
opposed to how defective you are. And then finally, we came up to the notion of a cheese list.
That's right.
What's that again?
Well, that's just simply listing down all the good to fantastic things that you bring to the table, and just simply objectively looking at that list and then realizing that you've got a lot to bring to bear, that there's a lot that you contribute in your relationships and in your work, in your home life.
And that's what you focus on expand.
And that's what you focus on, yeah.
So this will wrap up segment 1 of If I Knew Then What I Know Now. I'm Dr. Mitchell Perry with my friend Rob Holland here. I want you to know, sir, always a pleasure to work with you.
Likewise.
We're going to do some more recordings over time. We certainly encourage you to keep listening in. And if you would like to have more information about what we do here at JM Perry Learning, jmperry.com. I'm Dr. Mitchell Perry. This concludes segment 1 of If I Knew Then What I Know Now. We'll look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks for listening.